I think that does bring us to our Theology Corner topic. Are you ready?
I am.
All right, here we go. Alrighty, so what is our topic? As if we haven't said enough about it. What is our theology topic of the week?
Is it prayer?
It could be. Hey. So we've talked about again, we started off the channel talking about a movie where we tried to sort of wrestle with the idea of our will versus God's will and where prayer fits into that. But there's sort of just some difficult theological questions get raised when you try to wrestle with the idea of God's sovereignty, particularly views of it as strong as ours, and how does that go together with the encouragements or even commands in Scripture to pray, as if prayer makes a difference in some way. Like if God has plans, which He promises will be fulfilled, and He already had them before we prayed, where does our prayer fit into that?
The way that I've heard it expressed and the way that I've come to see it and have now expressed myself is that I believe that prayer was designed by God to be the means that He works His will through His people in many of these situations. It's a tool of His sovereignty in that regards.
Mhm.
So God has ordained these things to be, and He has ordained prayer as a method for how these things come to be.
Yeah, I remember. This is interesting. I remember when I was in seminary. Not a seminary that overall had any theology very close to mine. But there was one professor who made an interesting point where, like when we look at the biblical stories, for instance, where like someone like Abraham or Lot, uh, well, it was Abraham, I think in both cases I'm thinking of right now, or like Moses and Abraham,
Mhm.
where they intercede on behalf of God's people, for instance. It really seems like God is like haggling with them almost, you know.
Hmm.
So, but this professor of mine, he made an interesting point. For instance, I think was it Abraham? He prayed for, if this many people, uh, righteous people are in this city, will you stay your hand then? If this many, and like we look at that, we compare it to like, oh, it's like they're haggling over the price of a fish or something, and it's
Mhm.
like, well, no, but then he illustrated the teacher illustrated what was actually happening. That it's like if it was actually a haggling thing, uh, it would be like, so let's say I was buying a car from you and I said, I want to pay, $5,000, and you're like, well, I'll do 9,000. Well, I say, well, maybe I'll do six, and then you say, oh, okay, maybe eight, and we meet in the middle somewhere.
Mhm.
Um, that's not what happens with the story of Abraham interceding there. What happens is, um, he says, what about this many? And God says yes. And then he says, what about this many? God says yes. What about this many? God says yes. And throughout it is God more and more and more and more showing His already generous heart in that situation. And so like oftentimes like when we talk about prayer, particularly like I think things we've experienced when we look in like again, um more subjectively driven churches where like there's this profound emphasis put on the power our prayer supposedly has. It's
Mhm.
almost like we're giving God good ideas He didn't already have.
Right.
Um, and so like we look, but we'll often argue for those things. Like we look at the story of Moses where Moses intervenes, where God's like, I'm going to destroy these people. And then Moses is like, would you really do that though after saving them out of Egypt? And then God relents. It's like, oh, okay, so God is really harsh, but Moses is more merciful than God.
Hmm.
And He gave God a better idea than the one He had before. Right. And so we often think our prayer is actually like that, and it's not God teaching us something in His kind of subtle ways.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
at least that's my take on those passages. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Uh, and so, but knowing God is generous, how do we balance? Well, again, we can still kind of try to answer that question of. I mean, we've sort of given our answer with a view to God's sovereignty. But again, how do we balance that, knowing God's generosity, but also having the trust when something doesn't go our way? How do we
Hmm.
find that balance, do you think?
Well, I think, perhaps a helpful means of balancing it is to know, based on like what Romans 8 says, that everything that happens, um, that God is permitting in our life is for our good and his glory.
Mm-hmm.
So that doesn't just mean the events that shape our lives. I think that even means, I think it's connected to our prayer. Like, so whether something is answered in the affirmative, or he answers in the negative by saying, no, that's not my will for you.
Sorry.
We go ahead.
I'm
We
trying
can.
to check a notification during our stream here, but go ahead.
That's what happens.
Well, it's part of the video, but go ahead.
I think we can rest assured that whatever the answer is, even if it's even a delay in answering, that it's for our good and his glory. We can trust him with that because, again, he's a father, he's a good father, and he knows exactly what we need, and will provide those things. Um, Also, I think we do need to understand, as regenerated believers, those who are in the vine, we are drawing life from the vine, and so his desires are becoming our desires. So the more that is taking place, the more we're getting to know him and grow in him. What is coming out is the fruit of that, and so our prayer will be more in line with him. Again, you mentioned it. Our prayer isn't to shift God to do what we want him to do. It's really, um, prayer is a means that God shifts our will. He
Mm.
works on our hearts. And so I think all of those things are really helpful in understanding when something doesn't really go our way, um, that it really is for our good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another reason I was on my phone is I was wanting to get to a passage here in Romans, I think that helps me at least. Romans 8, do you remember this passage on prayer? Where it
Hmm.
talks about the Spirit's relationship to our prayer.
Yeah, yeah,
It's strange because like people are often very dogmatic when you downplay the supposed impact prayer has on God's will. Um, but they often forget the Spirit's involvement in prayer
yeah,
because it's very strange when you see Paul talk about prayer. It's almost like it's circular in terms of. So I'll read this so you can see what I'm talking about. But Paul is moving on from, he says, but if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. And then it says in verse 26 of Romans 8, likewise, the Spirit helps in our weakness,
mhm,
for we do not know what to pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. And he who
yeah,
searches hearts knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. And then it actually moves on to some of our favorite passages, and we know for all things work together for good. Um, and so like he's rooting prayer like in the idea of God's sovereignty, and then he roots that back into predestination and all that stuff right
mhm,
after that. But it's like it's almost like the Spirit is translating our bad prayers for us, is how I've
yeah,
sometimes heard it talked about. It's like we attempt our prayers, we try to conform ourselves to God's nature, and we try to pray, quote unquote, pray according to his will, but the Spirit knows the will of God.
mhm,
The Spirit inspires our prayers. And so it's almost like God praying back to himself what he wants
yeah,
at its best. So prayer is like part of God's sovereign plan. It's
yeah,
like you see it's subjectively working there in Romans 8.
yeah,
The Spirit inside of us praying according to the will of God at its best anyways.
yeah.
And so yeah, I'd say that's prayer being a means of God's will, as strange as that sounds, as circular as that sounds, it is very biblical, I think.
You even have that all the way back in Ezekiel. In Ezekiel 36, he says that I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes and be careful to obey, my rules. Like, there's a sense in that's, I think, Romans is elaborating on, under the new covenant, that, um, the Lord has put his spirit in us to do these things.
Mm-hmm.
We don't just walk in his statutes and obey all the rules on our own and even have words on our own, like in John 15, Jesus' words abide in us. And that's why we can ask and he will do.
Right.
He's doing the asking. He's working in us. God produces himself. Like, that's the fruit that's growing. It's not it I don't know why we're so afraid of that. That somehow fruit that's put in us won't be won't be of God. It'll be more of me or something. I don't know. I mean, obviously there's ways that this goes wrong. I'm not trying to paint a broad brush here and say that everything we'll ever ask is right, but could we just like actually believe what the scriptures say, that God is producing his desires in us, and be okay with the word desire, be okay with praying? Like, I think probably the reality is our prayers are too small.
Yeah, that could be a danger if you're too cessationist, I suppose. Not to pick on not to pick on Ash again, but no, like there can be that rightful anger about something like the prosperity gospel, where we see people centering on our human desires and greed and financial gain and using God basically as Santa Claus or something like that, and we can react against that, but suddenly make God stingy in our hearts. But there is a balance there where you walk in the Spirit and ask, and if you are growing in knowing and feeling, quote unquote, feeling the will of God, you can ask and he will answer.
I think the Lord will bring the balance there, if that's what we're looking for, because again, he has every right and authority to say no. Again, using a fleshly example, I can't tell you how many times Olive has asked me for things and I've said no, because I know what's best for her. A candy bar at 9:30 at night is not what's best for her. But I also know, being a father who wants to delight in my children, that she's asked for things and I've surprised her at times and been like, yeah, let's do that. Let's go for it, because there are times that I just want to love her that way. I've told her before, we have this thing in our household. There are times when I will actually come to her without even her asking me and say, hey, we're going to Walmart, I want to get you an I love you gift. And that's when I just kind of go and buy her like a little $5 or less trinket. And it's just I want to express my love to her in that way. And right now that looks like Pokemon cards. But
wait, that's demonic. No.
Well, there's a future episode.
I mean, I'm not into Pokemon enough to talk about, but I mean, I'm too holy, so. No.
Well, I'm sorry. Well, I'll go to your other channel then.
I mean, it's not like I played Doom and have made videos about how awesome Doom is for Christians to play, but
There we go. But I think, based on scripture, if I know how to give my daughter good gifts, how much more does the Father know how to give us good gifts? So again, I think that's kind of where it comes into, like, let's let the Lord really worry about the balance and things like that. Now, again, I'm all for calling out the prosperity gospel. I think it's wrong and demonic. And we probably should spend some time on that in a future episode, just in general, like some theology there. Because there's garbage in that. They don't. I sometimes wonder if we have the same Bible or something, because the way that they've twisted scripture and the God that they're twisting to get what they want out of him. There's a lot of questions that I have about salvation there. Whether it's real.
Yeah.
Questions that need answering.
Let's have a conversation.
Let's have a conversation about that. So I think that there's a right way to call out that type of abuse of it. But there's a whole theological framework that is wrong there. I think is, worrying about whether someone's asking too much in prayer, who has a good, solid theological framework. I think that maybe that we might need to push back on that a little bit and say, God is a big God, so you can ask for for his will to be done in all aspects of your life.
Hey, if you enjoyed that clip, make sure that you like and subscribe so that you can experience full-length videos, as well as the live show that I do most Fridays with Caleb. Hope to see you then.